Thanks for the introduction, Hon.
My dean, Scott Appleby.
Please hold your applause. I'm going to be very brief. I just want to welcome all of you. It's a little late to do that since you're about to leave, but I wish I could have been with you these 3 days. I was in Uganda and then got delayed in Amsterdam for a couple of days. If you've looked at the international news, you know that international travel these days is a little risky. So anyway, I've been out, but I've already heard great things about the session, and I know I will get reports and links and so on. So thank you all for being here. I think you all know at this point that we are in debt to the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation that has sponsored this series of workshops. This is the second one that brings together a trialogue of academics, faith leaders, journalists, and that mix has so far, on 2 occasions, including yours, produced really terrific conversations. Every once in a while, a firework or two, which is, we'd be bored without them, but also a lot of civil discussion and discourse across these different disciplinary and avocational barriers. And that's what we were looking for. So I'm really looking forward to this session since I did miss the others. And I know that our panel is going to tell me everything that went on succinct. So it's kind of like the edited version. But I want to thank my colleagues at the Ansari Institute, Mahan Mirza, particularly Dr. Alex Hsu, who this is his brainchild in so many ways, and Charles and others, Charlie and others that are associated with Ansari, but really Alex, thank you very much for putting all this together. If you have any complaints about anything, please let me know. Salary setting time is a ways away, but I will take note. Oh, you're a tough crowd, aren't you? You are ready for me to shut up so you can listen to this and go home. So that's what I'm going to do. Thank you for being here. No, there's a little too much time between what I said and your reaction. All right, so thanks for being here. Thanks for this great session. I look forward to hearing you. Thank you, Scott.
Well, thank you for being here tonight. We've been great to be at Notre Dame this week. I'm going to introduce you to the panel. This is Dr. Nicole Flores. She's an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia. Next to her is Imam Bilal Malik from the Islamic Center of Northeast Florida in Jacksonville. And next to Imam Malik is the Brendan McAllister, who's a former director of mediation and former victims commissioner for Northern Ireland. And I'm Bob Smetana. I'm a national writer for Religion News Service. And we've been in conversation this week. So the way this will work is we'll talk for a little bit, and then we're gonna ask some questions of folks who are part of the workshop, and then we're gonna ask some general public questions. So it's gonna be a conversation, and it should be quite enjoyable. So the first conversation is we all come from different places, from different disciplines, from different countries, from different religious backgrounds. So what have you found this week that has united us as we've had these discussions?
That's an excellent question. And thank you so much for moderating us tonight, Bob. For me, that's a really challenging question because I think one of the points and the purposes of our work together is in certain respects to highlight differences and disagreements in a certain respect, but I also have sensed a common commitment to deep care and compassion for the voices of those who have been whether you call it victimized or oppressed or marginalized. And I've been really inspired by that, whether that has been among the faith leaders, an attention to the pastoral needs of congregants in one's religious institution, or in the case of those in journalism, deep respect for sources and awareness of the risks that sources take when they tell difficult stories that prompt us to remember. And for academics, that comes from a sense of commitment to a rigorous professional standard that calls us to attend to the complexities and nuance of the stories that animate our research, and that we have that we care for in our work. So that's really struck me as a common commitment among us.
Can I have your mic? What I humbly believe is before being Muslim, I am a human being. And that's what unites us really. When someone is in dire need and I can help him or her, I'm not going to ask, are you Muslim? So I am going to help you, or are you Christian? Are you Jew? So what I humbly believe is we need to find, number one, the mutual ground. We need to see where we are going to be connected. And plus, this will be, I believe, not just faith leaders, even the parents, mothers, fathers. We need to teach our kids, number one, you are a human being. And the values of humanity should start from the childhood. Once I believe we achieve this, tolerance of other religions, of other ethnic backgrounds, of other humans would be easily built up. And those, in a other note, those who go a little bit in extreme, you will find them in each and every religion. I believe we need to be, again, very outspoken that we have nothing to do with that, regardless whatever ethnic background, race, religion we have. Thank you.
Well, my background is in peace mediation in my own country in Northern Ireland. And since my retirement, and in January of this year, I was ordained a deacon in the Catholic Church. So this week I've been drawing mainly on my background in mediation, but also obviously seeing a lot of life through a spiritual and religious lens, in my case, Catholic. I like to think of peace mediation as a method of non-violence. And as I shared with my colleagues during the workshop, I would define non-violence as a belief that you can promote or defend justice by serving truth with compassion. So I like to think that the three constituencies gathered these past few days share a love of truth when we're at our best, carry a distortion of truth when we're at our worst. Truth can be bitter and divisive. But as we've heard from the likes of Bob and others, there are moments when the integrity of a journalist or a writer requires that they bear witness to truth. There are moments when academics must analyze it and make sense of it for us. And there are moments when faith actors must try to look for the compassion within truth as well. Also, I'm minded to think about Pope John the 23rd at the onset of Vatican II, when he said, "The truth we've now come to realize is greater than any one of our formulations." In other words, the Catholic Church no longer saw itself as the one true faith. And I think it's the same in any interaction, any encounter between academics, media, journalists, people, and faith people. None of us, the truth that we're all working on is bigger than the grasp that any of us have.
You have such a way with words, Brendan, and I very much appreciate the beauty and the simplicity of framing our common commitment to truth with compassion. And that's manifest in many different ways and across the participants in the conversation. But it strikes me that common commitment to truth, but to the humanity, to follow up on your point as well, Bilal, is really a shared animating commitment and has functioned that way for the conversation in both the joys and the challenges that it has brought for us.
On a very quick note, we were discussing just a while ago about that Islam was spread through sword. And I was saying no religion could be imposed regardless. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, whatever religion, you cannot impose any ideology upon any human. It's not possible. What happened most of the time, Judaism came and it was very strong with values, with etiquettes, with equality, justice. People start adopting and forgetting what they had. Likewise with Christianity, likewise with Islam. So one thing I have learned, and from my actually sheikh in Arabic is the mentor. My biggest mentor to me was my own father. May God grant him high ranks in paradise. He was killed. Respect your religion, and you need to respect others as well. Everyone has their own boundaries. Do not cross that. So this is very, very important, and we find it in Quran, in the traditions of Prophet. We call it hadith, that you are not allowed to cross the line. You have to remain. And I was quoting actually from Quran, this verse 255, that you cannot impose your religion upon any. So yes, be faithful, be religious, and at the same time, do not impose it or try to impose it on others. We need to respect the boundaries of one another. Thank you.
Yeah. So I wondered if you could ask you all, is there something that you learned this week from another profession or someone from a different background that took you by surprise, that you didn't expect?
Go ahead.
Guess I'll go first. Actually, I'm so glad that I'm seated next to Bob and Bilal, because some of the most rewarding conversations I've had over the course of the week have been with the two of you in our trialogue breakout group. And without, revealing too much of the details around the conversation, because we want to protect confidential conversations from both the faith leader perspective and the journalist perspective. I've really valued thinking about trust and authority in relation to our respective professions. I think right now there's a lot of apprehension in our political culture about eroding status and authority in all three of these professions. But through the course of our conversation, I think it came from really it originated in an insight that you shared with us, Bilal, about how you build trust with your congregation, that you don't expect them to think that you have all of the authority and all of the right answers when you first arrive. And for me, as someone who, both in terms of my research and public voice, but also my classroom, which is of course crucial to the academic context, that really resonates with me. I think I've struggled with that erosion of authority, especially in terms of my racial, ethnic, and gender identity, that that I feel sometimes in the classroom that I'm coming up against these huge societal conflicts, and they're playing themselves out on my student evaluations. And really the conversations that we were having about how to build trust with sources, how to build trust with congregants, how to build trust with students it was very grassroots, that you're doing it within these smaller contexts. And these 30,000 foot conversations will continue, but that part of the work we're doing is at its base, in a micro context. And I really appreciated the insights that both of you brought to that conversation. I will take that with me as I go forward.
Yeah, where?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate. What happened with us most of the time, and coming here, it was a really, really amazing experience. We don't realize that we are living in a bubble and thinking that only I am the right person. What I think is the true thing. All other people, they are not that smart as I am. And when you start listening to others and their perspective, their mindset, their ideas, your actually thinking becomes broader and broader, and you become more optimistic, I believe. I'll give you an example. We were discussing, and I was having a session with youth in my center. And they were having some difficulties in not being like normal and judging others. I showed them some clips, some pictures. And one picture was of a dark room. I said, I want you to please guess what is inside. And I had almost like over 10 different perspectives. It could be sofa, it could be table, it could be this, it could be that. The second picture of that dark room, it was a kitchen. And then I made my point. When I don't know someone, something, some religion, ideologies, I start judging with my own guesses. Once you turn on the light, and light in Quran, light in gospel, and light in Torah is guidance, knowledge. If you know about one another more, that's how we get close to one another as humans. We know one another. We could see it. And that's what I'm taking from here, to always open my mind. One quotation of Quran, I love it. Almighty God asking Prophet Muhammad, in Arabic it goes, Qul, say always, Rabbi, my Lord, zidni ilma, increase in my knowledge. So I always used to wonder, Almighty God talking to a prophet, to the one who guides, and asking him, no, you need to keep on learning. You cannot think for 1 second that my knowledge is authority. That's the peak. I don't want to take longer, so please.
Nope, it's lovely to listen to you. There haven't been any surprises for me this week. But the opportunity to come away to a place of encounter is always a privilege, and this week has been. Thinking about your question, though slightly differently, about what insights do I take away? I've thought about this before coming to the table tonight. My wife and I were on holiday in Italy a few years ago, and we met 2 American women, middle-aged women, who had met on a previous holiday, got on very well, and booked to go on 2 holidays back to back, the one where we met them and a cruise next. And my wife, over drinks, asked them what they thought of President Obama at the time. And one of them said, he's terrible, he's a Muslim. And the other one took great exception to this, because it was a terrible slur to suggest that President Obama was a Muslim. Now, when you think about it, it's like, it's an insult that had to be defended, that you could be Islamic.
Mhm.
And I think it reflects in, the stage of history that we must be at in the world, and all that's happened, with Islamic fundamentalism, etc. But being with the Imam these past few days and hearing him explain Sharia as a paved way, that there is a Sharia of Muhammad, there's a Sharia of Moses, there's a Sharia of Jesus Christ. It was a new take for me on the way Sharia is presented as some kind of hardline fundamentalism. To have him challenge me in particular to understand jihad as struggle, not as holy war, and also the obligation in Islam for Muslims to live by the law of the land they live in, which in this country would make them among the safest Americans living here. So there is a lot of deconstructing of the mythology that has developed to be done. And there's where one would look to a journalist to write about that sort of thing, or an academic to analyze it in some way, and a faith person to appeal to people's consciences about it. Also, I have to say, a significant issue this week, Bob, has been a sense that for women, whether it be within Christianity or Islam, if women are going to advocate for change, not even about women, just about change, if you're a woman, then you have to engage the male domination of the leadership, the higher ranks of Christianity and Islam, so that women have additional obstacles in their way before they even make their point, which of course opens up issues about gender. There are more, but I'll stop at that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, Bob, I was wondering if you had a response to your own question.
Good one.
I did. It was it's always great to be in a place where people are fiercely committed to the pursuit of truth. And being fiercely committed to the pursuit of truth means you might say something, someone else is going to say something, you might say, that is just wrong. And here's why I think it's wrong. Or they might say something you disagree with, and you have to ask them, okay, what does that mean? Tell me more, because I want to know. And so there was kind of I was really surprised by the care and the professional way that every practitioner, every faith leader, every journalist, every academic, the care that they took in thinking about their work and pursuing what is true and how do you stand for what is right. And sometimes standing for what is right means great risk. And sometimes the people that you think that will stand with you won't stand with you. And that's difficult. And sometimes you just have to say, I hear you. And so there's kind of this commitment to truth, and it's commitment to making sure that we are careful in how we treat one another. And I will say one other thing. If the Obama comment is so strange, because we're in the United States of America, and what is one of the prime values? That there is no restriction on the free exercise of religion. So if Muhammad was Muslim, okay, isn't that awesome? If you were Christian, if you were a non-believer, so that's what we're supposed to be here for. And I think the question surfaces how we keep falling short of our ideals. And part of what this conversation has been about this week is what happens when we fall short of our ideals, and when the people whose values are supposed to be about truth and caring for people are used to harm others. And how do you talk about that in ways that are uncomfortable? I think that's the question I want to ask next. How do we talk about things that are very difficult, that are truthful, and yet don't ask people who survive great harm to be reharmed, be re-traumatized, or to risk everything? I think we see this in abuse, right? Why do people take a long time to come forward in abuse? Because when they come forward, they're not going to be believed, or they have to relive the worst part of their life, or whatever the kinds of events are. So I wonder if you have thought about, how do we tell those stories without re-traumatizing folks, and tell them in ways that remind us of what is true, but don't harm other folks?
Oh, I think someone else.
I wonder if Brendan might, you feel okay?
Yes.
Well,
This is your
yeah.
specialty.
Fair enough. That's right. This has been my living for a long number of years. I remember one night I was facilitating a civic meeting in my town. There was a retired very senior police officer there, and there were Republicans, IRA supporters in one part of the room, and there were constitutional nationalists who were against the IRA and were Catholic in another part, and there were Unionist Protestants in another part of the room. And the toughest part of the night was the constitutional nationalists who had not supported armed struggle, giving a hard time to the police officer. They got very emotional, and he had to take a lot of flack. And at one point, one of the Protestant leaders said, "Mr. Chairman, are you going to let this happen? What kind of mediator are you?" And I said, "Yes, I'm going to let this happen," because people were being honest. There's often an expectation with dialogue that there's this notion that if only people could have dialogue, everything could be good. But actually, in the early phases of dialogue, things usually get worse
Yes.
because people are expressing the conflict. You have to express it, so that you have to design dialogue or trialogues. You have to design encounter communication, shall we say, between people. There's another point. In our setting in Northern Ireland, there was a time when dialogue was a Catholic word, because the Catholic side were demanding dialogue all of the time, and the Protestant side had difficulty talking to certain people. It was compromising their integrity. So words have a shelf life. Sometimes it's better to give them a rest for a while, even including the word peace can get overworked.
Yeah.
So back to your question, then I'll stop. You have to pay attention to the design of encounters between people. You have to always remember the need for compassion. But with regard to the danger of re-traumatizing, I have to say, in the mediation business, you go for it. People get hurt. As I said the other day, it's impossible to talk about difficult things without encountering the pain involved. So for some people, you have to meet with people ahead of encounters, make an assessment as to whether or not they're ready for it, fit for it. Don't be asking them in if they're not, and look after them. You have a duty of care. So it's not necessarily about preventing the pain, no more than a dentist can prevent pain, but they mitigate it. So it's about good process design.
You offer a couple of really helpful points, and to those overworked words, I would like to add the word civility. And I spoke with some of the other participants over the course of the week that in my book, Our Lady of Guadalupe, sorry, The Aesthetics of Solidarity, Our Lady of Guadalupe and American Democracy. You can get that from Georgetown University Press. One of the areas of the book where I've received the most pushback is when I try to give a little bit more meat to the understanding of civility. James Keenan, Father James Keenan, who's a Jesuit and was a teacher of mine, very much influenced my thinking about civility, in that he rejects that it is merely politeness or good manners, but that it requires a respect and a commitment and conflict. that civility doesn't mean, oh, we're going to avoid the conflict or the problem. I still received a lot of pushback about that portion of my book, and maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to let that word lie fallow and let another one arise, because that word seems to have a lot of baggage attached to it right now, and I think that's fair. I wrote this book primarily during the Obama years, which were different years. But I think, as we approach these conversations, being aware of the baggage that even our buzzwords carry is very important. But also to the question about how to tell these stories, and who is, for me, it's a question of who is bearing the burden of this telling. My own thinking about this is deeply influenced by the work of Danielle S. Allen, who's her primary political science or social. I think it's poli-sci. She's of course a genius and quite brilliant, but her work on sacrifice in relation to the common good, I find to be really helpful on this point, because she points out that during the civil rights movements, the people who were being asked to make sacrifices for racial justice in the country were often Black children who were being sent to desegregate schools and whose lives and safety were being threatened. And that a part of our work of pursuing the common good is to interrogate who's being asked to sacrifice, what they're being asked to sacrifice, and her analysis really opens our eyes to the fact that those who are being asked to sacrifice are already those who are most vulnerable in most cases. So the question from my perspective as an ethicist is, normatively, how do we shift that balance so it's not always the most vulnerable who are being asked to bear that burden over and over and over again? And I think that over the course of the week, that has really, Alan's analysis has been kind of in the back of my mind, just sounding the alarm. Okay, a lot of people who we're talking about in these stories, and the people who are being forgotten in the narratives are already those who've been asked to bear more of their fair share of the burden for us all.
I would like to thank my colleagues for becoming my shield. Actually, it varies when someone coming to you for assistance, for help, or someone in desperate need. The good preacher or a good faith leader or a community leader, a teacher, we need to assess their needs. What are their requirements? Brother Arif was just mentioning about Afghanistan, and 97% of the population under poverty. Now, if we go there and provide them anything but what they need, want help. Likewise, I think Jessica was mentioning today about someone hurt, and I try to impose spirituality on them. It won't work. So one thing which we need to realize that give as leader what public are looking for, not something else. If they are in need of guidance, let's provide it to them. If they are in need of some financial assistance, let's provide it to them. So we need to see and assess what everyone is in need of. And again, this will be coming from someone who is really wise and mature. Otherwise, we will be messing up. Thank you.
I have one more question, then we're going to, I have many more questions, but I have one more question that we're going to talk about. And at the end of that question, I'm actually going to ask other folks to participate, folks from the workshop. So start, as I ask this question, folks who are a part of the workshop this week, if you can think about your answers and what you might want to say. I'm going to take a little point of privilege as the moderator to think about something Brendan and Nicole said, and the mom said, that when we do an investigation, there's like a pre-meeting. And the pre-meeting is someone says, I have a tip, and there's an off-the-record meeting. I've learned from some other investigative journalists that people want to tell their story, and it has been silenced for so long that it's pent up, that they want to get it out. And you almost have to say, okay, now this is how it works. Do you have questions for me? Can you tell me, what do you want to know from me about this process? And I go over the process, which will involve, asking you a lot of questions. Some may be uncomfortable. They may be things you don't want to talk about that I may have to press on. I'm going to have to go to the people that you talk about. If someone has injured you, and ask them. I'm going to ask, do you have emails and documents, and what can you show me so that I have the strongest case to back up your story? Otherwise, the story can be dismissed. And give them agency to say, you can say no. You should be able to say no all the way through this process. Now, once we and then before we say the words on the record, and I usually, even after we say on the record, it's like, okay, are you ready? Like, this is going to be coming, and give people warning so that there's warning and there's informed consent. We don't call it that, but it's kind of what we try and do, is give people consent to say, okay, you know what you're getting into. And some people say, yes, I know what I'm getting into. And they might, but at least there's a process of thinking through that. Because when someone wants to tell you, you like, oh, I want to know. The journalist part of you. So the question I'm going to ask is, what are the temptations we face in our work? And the temptation of a journalist is to get the story no matter what. And there's a story that the story is the end all and be all, and you treat people as the means to get the story. Because there are benefits to being an investigative reporter, for example. They're not always great. Like, people call you all kinds of things, and sometimes they dox you now, and if you ever look up my name, Bob Santana and Dave Ramsey, you will get a master class. And Mr. Ramsey and I had a go round that is quite interesting about you shouldn't listen to the freelance writer lives in his basement, which I don't, but apparently, it's kind of, I can laugh at it now, but there is a kind of like celebrity that can come from it. You can get awards, you can get book contracts, you can get a sense of, I've taken on the wrongdoer and I'm the hero when I'm not the hero. But those are the temptations for us, to really see ourselves as the hero, but also to use other people in ways that are well-intentioned but harmful. So I wonder if you have like things, or what are the risks or temptations, or risks or temptations that you face?
Well, I won't presume to speak for all academic disciplines in terms of temptations, but in my area of ethics, there's a temptation, I think, towards abstraction to the point of disengagement with lived realities. And so here in the trialogues, the work that I presented was not on its face particularly ethical. It was concern for the fate of Latino parishes and artwork and politics, little tiny parishes in Denver, Colorado, on the north side of Denver. But I think for me, the function of that work is to resist this temptation that I could really, honestly, in ethics, there's a temptation to not even read works that are written outside of the English language in Christian ethics, because you don't have to. Most of the important works are translated, so you're not even encountering in language. You're not encountering people in lived situations, because you don't need to do ethnography to do ethics. So there's all of these ways to kind of avoid that engaged reality. And one trend I'm seeing among Christian ethicists, religious ethicists more broadly, moral theologians, is an awareness that this is our temptation and that it is necessary for us to resist that temptation and not to forego that analytical work, abstraction for abstraction's sake. I've done some work on Rawls and I enjoy a good thought experiment, but that can't be it. So I'll confess that as my temptation.
So you have to appreciate that working as a practitioner in my own country, it'd be like being a white American male mediating among ethnic groups, where one of the constituencies at the table was white American and male. So there are all sorts of things one has to do when you're not perceived as neutral. Oh, and actually you're not neutral. If you're just yourself. So when you work in your own society, you have to be more than yourself, but you must remain authentic. Certainly in our setting, people didn't trust someone who appeared not to have a background, not to have feelings, not to have a soul. So, but you have to make sure that yourself remains small. in a situation, and never let your light shine brighter than the people you're working with. So you'd be in situations where you're having great ideas, you have to suppress them and never let your light shine more. There's also, it's important to know the difference between personality and character. You know, someone can have, I've been with people like in prisons with very charismatic personalities, but not good character. And I've been with people with really good character who are not very sociable, not very approachable. And it's very often the case in a situation of conflict that you're going to like one or two of the players and not particularly like others. And you can get distracted by that. There's also a danger of being, as I think I said today, being seduced by the relationship. You may be in a situation where you've got access to someone whom others haven't been able to get access to. Just, I'm sure journalists face that. And the relationship and holding on to that can affect your judgment and your capacity to do your job. Also, the big one, though, I want to draw attention to is beware of the technocratic paradigm. This the Pope has written about. You will forgive me as a Catholic deacon, taking references to the Pope. I can get away. I have license to do that. Yeah, thank you. But it's something I'm very concerned about, because technocracy is invading everything. And so, for instance, I've been in situations where people are doing something because the funder expects that, not because the situation requires it, where interventions are measured in a way that was agreed with a funder and their objectives. And lastly, the danger to confuse sympathy with empathy. In your efforts to get alongside people in situations of conflict, you can end up saying things, and they might be true, you might actually agree with them, but they compromise you, because it's amazing how people in conflict eventually talk to each other. And they say, oh, he really agreed with me, you know, he didn't like you. And the other would say, well, it's the opposite. And then they'll think, you can't trust this person, and they might be right.
Actually, I'm talking last to look more wiser, but actually, I'm not. Temptations to every single human. I learned from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and peace be upon all prophets of God, that 3 areas of temptations are really, really dangerous for all humans. On top, wealth, money. Number 2, power. Number 3, fame. And the wordings he was using, worshipper of, at that time they used to call dinar, the coins of gold, worshipper of fame, worshipper of chair, power. These 3 really troublemaking if we don't control our attachment. I remember I was asking my teacher, my mentor beside my father, that how do I know that I'm not a worshiper of wealth? I live to earn. I'm going from my morning till evening and I'm earning. So am I not a worshiper of money? And his amazing actually reply was, as long as you don't live for the sake of money, as long as money serving you, you are fine. But if it goes other way around, you live for the sake of money, now you are in trouble. Likewise with other temptations as well. And very briefly and quickly, I'm going to add up one more point, which we were discussing on our first day, Monday, about sex abuse and children getting abused. What happened, we turned people into, and I'm sorry to use the term, as gods. This man is really powerful, not touchable. And now what happens, they misuse, somehow even abuse their powers. And likewise, some even organizations, they go beyond, they are not touchable. As Anila was mentioning about few people, that we cannot touch them. Regardless, we know that they have violated, that they have done a lot of bad stuff. We cannot touch them. So if again, as a faith leader, we need to remain humble in our limitations, knowing that all these things are to accommodate us and not other way around. Thank you.
So I wonder if there's one of our practitioners from this week that has any thoughts on this and the kind of temptations that you face in your work or the risks.
Yeah, so I was really struck by two of the things that Brendan said that I think parallels really closely to journalism, which is I think we are expected as journalists to suppress ourselves because no one's neutral, right? But we're supposed to be. And so I think I found myself a lot of times writing stories to satisfy the idea that I needed to do the opposite of what I believed in order to like give myself credibility. And part of that is also the sacrifice of the funder, which is your editor, which is the newspaper that you work for, and writing the type of stories that they want to hear, the type of stories that are going to get clicks. And I think journalists in general, I mean, at this point, we're slaves to what trends, what stories, and this goes back to the sacrifice we make when we talk to our sources and not knowing, you know, at the end of the day, what effect that will have on them, because we write the story and we move on, but their pictures are out there, their stories are out there. And I'm sure we'll get more into that here in a bit, but I think that's the temptation.
Yeah, like Belen said, and I really related a lot to what Brendan was talking about your soul and your light. When I talk to sources in vulnerable positions, I have to bring myself into that conversation. Otherwise, it's not fair, I felt. And I always wondered if I was doing journalism wrong because I was sharing myself with that person. And I think as I've grown older in my career, I like to work as a partner with sources. And I have many follow-up conversations with people because I want to make sure when I'm getting it right, and I want to make them feel involved in it. Because I have felt early on in my career that I just used a person in my story and then I moved on to the next. And so I really related with what Brendan was talking about.
Yeah. And Alejandra, could you introduce yourself? So when you have
Oh, yes. So I'm Alejandra Molina, and I'm a reporter for Religion News Service.
And Belen, could you just introduce yourself?
Belen Hollers, Dallas Morning News.
Anyone else want to say something? Or should we have more? We have many more questions. So I'll ask more questions. So one of the questions I want to ask some of the folks from the workshop this week is, what are the risks that sources have, or survivors of abuse or marginalized communities face in talking to reporters? What are the kind of risks for them they may not be aware of that we've learned about this week or talked about?
I'm going to cheat and just cite Brian Kleitz again. When we're talking about Catholic sex abuse, we added an event called Never Forget. Truly, truly always forget. We ask survivors to share traumatic experiences. We require them to provide truly an orgy of evidence to prove they survived what they survived. They bring that story forward in hopes of justice, reconciliation, recognition. And everyone gets very upset about it for a hot minute, and then it goes away. And then we are shocked all over again when these stories come forward, because abuse is systemic, because we let abuse happen every place it can happen. And then we ask again survivors to tell those stories when we are again shocked. And that sucks, and we need a better way, and we owe survivors more.
And Megan, can you tell us who you are? So for the people on Zoom. can-
Sure. Hello, camera. I am Dr. Megan Goodwin. I am the author of Abusing Religion, which is a book that talks about religious sex abuse.
And Jessica, you were going to say something.
I'm Jessica Messman, Associate Editor of the Christian Century magazine. As Megan said, I think one of the things that came out of this workshop experience for me was realizing how forgotten so many of the sources are, and the in abuse stories, and the crashing revelation that Me Too really didn't accomplish much besides ruining a lot of women's lives, exposing them in ways, exploiting their desire to help other women by disclosing their most awful moments, most humiliating moments. And then, as we said, the news cycle moves on. That person is left with their story in print, Googleable, their picture everywhere. Anytime they apply for a job and an employer goes to check them out on Google, as everyone does, that's the searches that come up, the research results. And I really want to, I want to find their stories now. I want to accompany those women somehow. I feel deeply obligated to go back to these people and find out what price they paid for our news cycle of those stories, for a trending hashtag, for a movement that promised so much and seemed so full of promise, and yet is still repeating itself over and over. And it's a trend we see in stories about abortion rights. It's just a never-ending cycle of women disclosing their most awful moments and memories in the efforts of making real and lasting change and being heard. And we gobble up those stories, and then they're just left behind.
Someone on the panel, do you want to weigh in? Anyone else or have?
Thank you for all of you for your comments. But Jessica, what you say resonates with me as an ethicist, and it compels me to think about, what is right, good, just in the situation in terms of the treatments of sources. Yes, for these stories, but also, in academia and within the structures of the university. One theme that emerged in the academics group is that we're acutely aware of the power imbalances within the university, the erosion of tenure and tenure track lines, and how that leaves our colleagues vulnerable not only to losing jobs, but being fired for doing really work that really challenges institutions. So what is it that we need to do? How ought we interact with our sources in the first place? So that gets back to your question, but your comments compel me to want to think more about what we owe to those who have been put in this position. And back to my Danielle Allen a girl crush, it's like, what do we owe to those who've been sacrificed for this shared good, and who were already most vulnerable, and whose, you're right, lives have been destroyed
I
by
was
this.
going to bring it back to Danielle Allen too, and to your comment based on that work. I want to think through with all of the people that I've met this week and continue these conversations about, it didn't work. It doesn't work. We're doing it over and over again. It damages people. It ruins their lives. It doesn't create lasting and real change. How do we stop asking the most vulnerable to be the ones carrying all of this labor for us and hold the people who actually have the power accountable.
I wonder too if we have not reflected enough on, in journalism ethics, I don't know if we've reflected enough on the way that it gets a little to brains that technology has changed the way stories live. So if you, I was thinking about photos. So if you take a photo of someone who's particularly vulnerable, if there were always wire services, the story could go everywhere. Then it went in the photo morgue. And so if you wanted to get that photo, someone had to go down, get permission and use it. It wasn't, now if I'm doing a story and I have a photo that sort of fits it, the story, it is like, you know, abuse. Click, bunch of pictures. Oh, that's a good one. Click, click. Now it is on the internet and it is everywhere and it's tagged and searchable. And so I don't know if we thought about, because you can go to newspaper archives, you can go to magazine archives, but the kind of you go to academic journal archives, so you don't have the mass amounts of data. We have ethics that are not that we're not set up for mass amounts of data that live forever.
And are we being careful with our sources to say, if we take this photograph of you and we run it with your story, it may be run in any number of stories on the same topic. Belen had an example of this in our workshop where I will let you tell the story actually, but where this happened and where she was deeply troubled by the idea that someone's traumatic moment that she was invited into and gained trust might play out again and again. So I don't know if you have more to say about that.
Yeah. I'll share. And I think part of the reason that prompted the conversation this morning was because I was preparing for this workshop and I was going through and that image is posted again on the newspaper. And that image has nothing to do with that story. This was a story from almost a year ago now, right? September of 2021. And this is a young woman who's 22 years old, who's having the worst moment of her entire life. And I'm asking her the worst questions that no one wants to be asked. But it's under the guise of, oh, you need to share your story. You need to share your story. But even like for me, it's traumatizing to see the image, and that didn't happen to me. And we also don't talk about that, right? Like what happens to the people who also are telling the stories and what happens when we see the images again and then we relive it. And I think a lot of us kind of had those experiences this weekend or this week where we were like, oh, wait a second, that's bothering me a lot more than I realized. And man, every time I see that damn picture, I can't get that story out of my head.
Yeah. Real quickly, just because this came up very early in the week. This has been the case with the photographs taken in Charlottesville on the day of the Unite the Right rally, both in terms of the re-traumatization, photographs taken of people as, cropped out of the shot are the images of the Unite the Right rally participants holding guns and weapons. You just see these images of clergy, inspiring people by linking arms, but the violence is cropped out of there, but also the use of those photos without the permission of those who have taken them, who also risk their lives. One of those photos was used for a story of mine without proper permissions from the outlet. And the photojournalist asked that it be removed. So it just means that I have now in my story, there's a really boring picture of a very famous old white Jesuit. But that's, in my mind, that's okay, because this journalist was asserting a claim both over his intellectual property, but also a moral claim. This is a traumatic experience for people. So to use this without permission just re-traumatizes. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Sorry, Susan.
Remember to tell us who you are.
Yeah, thanks. No, Belen, I'm so grateful for your sharing that story. I'm Susan Reynolds. I teach Catholic Studies at Emory University in Atlanta. What so much of this is evoking for me is this question that I think has lived in the back of my mind for a long time, which is when we think about the production of scholarship, of public knowledge, of journalism, as content, the contentification of all of this, of photographs, of words, of op-eds, right? I mean, there really is a sense of objectification there. I think it objectifies very often the material, and I think it objectifies the source, and I think it objectifies the author. And this affects academics as well as reporters. I think so much of this story, and we've had this conversation in a lot of different ways this week. This was one of the things that I realized I've been thinking this too, and finally I have words for it. There's so much, rah sus boom ba around kind of public scholarship, and I've done a lot of public scholarship myself. But I think the allure, right, is always that any one of us, little old academics with some very niche little interest are only, 800 to 1200 good words away from the next star op-ed. And that we should all want that, and that that's our responsibility. And there are ways in which that's true. And I love my 800 to 1200 word every so often pieces myself. It refines my scholarship, I think, and I think it does do a service. But I think that so much of that is about content production, and academics become sort of wrapped into that world of content production. And there's a point at which you recognize sometimes, depending on who you're working with, that's what I'm doing. I'm producing content for you. And that's not why I'm here. I'm thinking about the photos, Bill, and when you were talking about the photographs and how easy it is to just, the keywords now, and all you have to do is just type a couple words and up comes the next photo for the next story, and it runs in perpetuity. I mean, I'm thinking about some of the photos that I include in my book and how they came to me as physical photos, right? And just in the difference, the affective difference there, reaching out, having to track down their original photographers. And one of the pictures that I showed was by a photographer named Lisa Keller, who's actually at Boston College now. She just actually ran a really powerful exhibit, a photographic exhibit in Boston in March on the sex abuse crisis. I'm using a photo of hers that she took in 1998, so a really long time ago. And she was really generous in granting permission. I'd come across it in the Archdiocesan archives originally, but she said, "Hey, could you email me the scan that they did of it? I want to make sure that they got the colors right." It was a photograph of 3 African-American teenagers. I'm going to make sure that they calibrated the colors right. I mean, it was black and white, but the levels and stuff. And just, the care that she took with that, and how different that would be if it was just, reproduced somewhere and then somewhere again and somewhere again, maybe in a story that had nothing to do with the place where it was taken, or became just another sort of stock image. And so, I guess maybe thinking normatively, right? Like Nicole does, what does this call us to in our various professions? But like, how do we resist the contentification of the work that we do because we care?
And the word we use with content is consume. It's the way we don't read, we don't watch, we consume.
I'll add a couple thoughts. Kristen Dumais, Calvin University, and looking at the 3 days altogether, I think in just so many ways, realizing how many unexamined practices we participate in. And I'm thinking of Dr. Syed Hussein's presentation as well on social media and how that actually works. And it was stunning to me to realize how so many of us inhabit these spaces in social media and organizations and nonprofits and news agencies without perhaps doing some rudimentary research in, are we actually achieving the goals we think we are achieving through this image, through this text, and it feels like we're in such an urgent space right now in this country, in this world, in terms of our democracy. And I think we each feel like, we have critical roles that we can play. But as Jessica pointed out, is this working? And have we stopped to ask if our practices are in fact conducive to our ends. And so I think that was a wealth here of the interdisciplinary nature and the interfaith nature, and just the multi-practitioners, that we have some really hard thinking to do, and the thinking is being done in different corners, different researchers out there. But this collaborative space is so necessary.
That's important because Me Too is a model for what's going on right now with abortion access, right? So we're using women, we're using victims the same way we use people, right, a couple of years ago, but we don't have answers. I think that's why, that's what really has been the biggest takeaway for me, is like, I want answers to that, because these women are going to have to deal with the same thing 10 years from now. And is that worth it? And that's major to me.
There's a question one of the questions I have is, and this could be for the panel or for any one of our participants, is the question of how do you, at the same time, be careful, expand the number of people we talk to, expand the kind of voices, and then how do we frame those voices? One of the social media presentation was really fascinating about showing several photos, one with a headline of, look at how terrible this is happening to people. And the other was, look how great it is that people have rallied together in this terrible time. And which one did you use? And what was the message sent by that? But I wonder if there are lessons if there are practices we have about how do you get more people into the conversation? I know I was going to ask Alejandra, actually, because she's talked a bit about this, but how do you get more people who haven't been recognized or heard from, because they're not the loudest, or they, and when you're a reporter, and maybe an academic as well, or even a faith leader, the person you quote or talk to is the person who picked up the phone. And during COVID, the person who could answer an email, but there wasn't the, how do I get out beyond those kind of boxes?
Well, pertaining to my specific beat and covering Latino communities and religion, I think my personal lived experience and my background really does help me a lot. And because I have somewhat always been willing to share a bit more about myself, I feel like people feel comfortable enough to talk to me. But I learned to involve people more in the process of writing a story. I explain, before I start my interview, I explain what newsroom I work for. This is what we cover. And I specifically cover this, and this is my intention with this story. And let me know if you feel comfortable talking about this or that. So I've learned to I've learned for it to be more of a for them to participate in the process of it. And because I have felt that my own communities have not been represented well in media, I do feel that responsibility myself to cover other voices that are not represented well. Oh, yes. So I recently wrote a story about Muslim Americans and how they approach abortion access and abortion rights. And it was something that I was seeing talked a lot on social media. And there were a lot of voices that were not being represented the right way. And I felt that, okay, well, maybe I can write about this. And it was an issue that I was very nervous about writing about, because I am not part of this community. I don't understand what their religion says or doesn't say about abortion. And so I felt like I was learning as I was writing it. And I approached it that way, in terms of, hey, I know I'm not part of your community. I'm seeing this conversation taking place. Can you help me understand this? And I did feel like for that story, I wanted a voice where a Muslim woman had an abortion, and I wanted her to explain to me what did your religion have to do with it, or did it have anything to do with it? And I didn't, but I knew that I didn't want to convince somebody to talk to me about that experience. I didn't want to be like, it's important to share your story because, you know, for the sake of it, it's important to have your voice out there. And so what I did is I saw that a professor had spoken about that experience in public on Twitter. And I approached it that way because it was something that she had made a choice to talk about. I wondered if she would want to talk more about it. And so I approached that voice that way. And so I felt like it was, it was not a story I turned around in the span of 2 days.
Yeah.
And so that's really important to share because I think we're so inclined to have a quick turnaround story because, oh, well, the road decision was made today, so I need to have a story tomorrow. So it's a story that definitely you tell your editor, I'm not going to turn this around in a day or two because I need to digest the information and understand it and write it with some kind of authority where I feel like I have it right.
Shalom.
Yeah, go ahead.
We did not hear anything from this side. I don't know.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so
And I'm going to just very briefly, because this topic is really, really deep about victims who are victimized and no one helped them. In fact, they get worse by day. One thing which I have learned, I was searching about why Islam spread very quickly. Within 25 years, even less, it was all around the world at that time, all around the civilized world. And what I observed personally, maybe I'm wrong, that justice was equally for all, which I don't even see it here in the most advanced society in the world right now. If you remember about, I was actually in Sanford for 12 years where Trayvon Martin was killed. And I remember my conversation with someone who was here for a longer time than myself that, of course, this man will be in trouble. He said, no, he's white and rich. And white privilege is going to show you what magic it does. And that's what happened, unfortunately. So even in the most advanced society in the world, we have colonized, this is black, this is brown, this is this. And then, of course, when it comes to powerful person, forget about it. I am going to quote here, Umar was the second caliph. His son committed a crime and he penalized him himself. That after, I think, a month or so, he got wounded and died. His own son. Fourth caliph, Ali, they had dispute him and a Jewish, and Ali is standing on the, like in court and as accused, and it went against him. He was the ruler. So this is, I believe, simply number one cause that those who are victims, they are helpless. They know that no one is going to help me because I am poor or I am not having enough sources. I go to prisons, and when I see so many people, they are innocent, but they don't have sources to prove their innocence. They don't have money, enough money. So that is one major reason. Thank you.
So we have a little bit of, we got 15 minutes left. And I have one question I'm gonna ask the panel, but I wonder if there are questions from the audience, or if someone who hasn't spoken has something they want to say, but I wonder if you have questions for what, well, yes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Arif, and I'm from Afghanistan. I'm a fellow at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies here. I know that we are in the very beginning of the session, so I will just ask a big question that has been in my mind for a long time, for years actually. A lot of times when we talk about trauma, we think about it as an event. And so it has happened. This is what we do, and then we get over it. What do we do if we are living in a state of constant trauma? My country has been in war for more than 40 years. And so those people, we do not have the luxury of dealing with trauma as events because it's happening every day and it's piling up. How do we address trauma in that type of a context? Thank you.
Well, can I answer that as a former victims commissioner for victims of the conflict in Northern Ireland? There was a study on the epidemiology of post-traumatic stress disorder in Northern Ireland that suggested the levels of PTSD were higher than in the Middle East. I was a bit skeptical about that, given the nature of violence in the Middle East. I had an advisor who was a consultant psychiatrist, and he took the view that there was the danger at one point in our work on victims coming after the ceasefires when things were relaxing was, oh my God, the whole country's traumatized. I mean, the violence had been going on for decades. And there's one Boston-based academic, Kaita Weingarten, I think she's called, who's written a lot about witnessing. She would say that in a conflicted society like yours, you're either a victim survivor or you're a witness. And even that is traumatic. But the psychiatrist friends suggested that we focus on those who develop mental health needs. That if a lot of people through family and even indeed by faith communities were coping and getting on okay, just like imagine large populations after World War II, for instance, then you didn't need to focus on them and don't build it up. If there is a word for it in mental health terms, it'll come back to me in a minute. But if people are coping, then they're fine. The difficulty is people go into phases later in life where they're not coping. And I remember a few years ago listening to a talk show on the radio. A woman was ringing in to say that her husband was having nightmares and was beating her in his sleep. He was 89 years of age. He was back in his mind to D-Day and in his youth. So it hadn't been a problem all his life, but when he was vulnerable in old age, these matters were coming back. So trauma is, on the one hand, a massive problem, and it's going to be a massive problem in countries such as Afghanistan. On the other hand, resilience, that's the word I'm looking for. The human beings are amazing. And there is an amazing resilience, and we've got to affirm that. Because if we don't affirm people's natural ways of being resilient, then we create dependency in them and a need for assistance that professionalizes trauma to a ridiculous degree, and it's a need that we can't meet. Having said that, then there will be people coming out of traumatic situations, come out of war situations with special traumatic needs. And we need to focus on those who aren't being resilient, who are demonstrating need.
I don't have a good answer so much as an affirmation of the question and some additional reflections, because it does strike me that, and this also emerged in the conversation over the course of the week, that trauma is multidimensional, and it's individual and communal, and it's an event, and it's ongoing, and it's a system of techniques and tools for managing as it comes, and in certain respects, it's beyond our control, as much as perhaps we wish that it was something that we could control. All of that to say, I think the communal dimensions of trauma and our need to respond to them and to think about them. This is, I do not want to undermine the fact that in Afghanistan, the needs are very particular and the trauma has gone on for so long and it's continual. That is distinctive. And I would take nothing away from that. We also are still in an experience of global trauma concerning the pandemic that has affected people in different parts of the world very differently. My wedding anniversary is August 12th, which is the anniversary of the Unite the Right rally in the city where I live. It is also, it will be the 1-year anniversary of the death of my cousin from COVID-19. A cousin who's 2 years older than me in age. And this date has just become associated with these things. And the thing that is hardest about contending with this trauma is that we're all trying to move on. We're, and I think one of the issues is that we don't have a collective, we don't have collective practices of mourning, even in laments, ones that are, they need not be the same one for every person, but ones that we can participate in perhaps across difference. When my cousin died, he was unvaccinated. So I shared, that he had died on Twitter and people said, well, he should have been vaccinated. I was like, well, sure. Absolutely. I wish he would have been vaccinated. He wasn't. And he's dead. And so what kind of practices do we need and habits, frankly, do we develop to engage in that process on a societal level, in addition to kind of the more Western view of things of like, oh, this trauma is individual, it's private, you don't talk about it. Why would you ever say that your cousin died in front of, a room and an internet full of strangers? Well, this is a trauma I'm sure others of us have shared, and a part of dealing with trauma, at least in my own experience, has been truth telling. So again, no good answers, but I really appreciate your question. And I thank you for asking it.
Yes.
I want to thank you for being vulnerable with that question. And I also want to acknowledge that citations don't fix anything, but I wonder if you're familiar with the work of Christina Sharp, and I'm thinking particularly of her book In the Wake, where, and thank you, Nicole, for calling us to specificity, because the trauma that is still ongoing in Afghanistan, obviously, is not equivalent to any other trauma. But I think that there might be resonances in the way that she talks about the violence, not just of the enslavement of Black people, but of the failure of America to account for that violence, to ignore that violence, to specifically forget that violence. And the fact that it has not even been named renders it unmournable. I do think Nicole's call for collective mourning is important. I also think for those of us in this room, in this country, that there's a collective responsibility and accountability for the violence and the trauma that's been caused. Americans are accountable for that trauma. And I don't know that there's anything that we as a country or we as individuals could do to make up for the absolute devastation of American involvement in Afghanistan. But I feel like we gotta try a little bit. So Christina Sharp is great. Check out the book. The end.
Hi, my name is Pete. I teach in the American Studies department here at Notre Dame, and I'm also a faculty fellow of the Ansari. I don't know if this totally speaks to your question. I hope it flows off it. One thing that really struck me this week was how each person in the group, whether a practitioner, a faith leader, academic or journalist, has their own relationship with faith. Some of us fell back on faith or needed faith to engage difficult questions. Others did not. But it just struck me as that we're all taking a risk by engaging religion in the way that we are. We're putting our own faith lives on the line and our own lives on the line to engage religion, which is potentially a destructive force or a force for good. And I think trauma, on one level, it can go, when you confront this, it can go either way. It can be something you deepen your faith with as you look to a spiritual life to help you guide through it. On other hands, it can destroy a spiritual life. And faith is something very fragile. But I think I just kind of flowing out these questions, but not only we're risking something about our own interior self, our own lives, what we hold sacred by engaging religion in this way, but we all feel called to do it, to write about it, because we know it's a significant force in society, but we also know it's something that can ultimately be turned back on our own interior selves. That was something I found really courageous and interesting about our group. I myself, write about the Catholic Church in the 20th century, partially out of a desire to be close to it as a thinker and a spiritual life. But I also feel very important that we feel very committed to engaging the traumatic things that it does to people in society. The clergy abuse crisis. I'm gearing up to teach a class in the Vietnam War and American Catholics. Catholics were instrumental in starting and helping to sustain and start the war. And if you go down to the grotto here at Notre Dame, you'll see a statue of Thomas Dooley. He was one of the major sort of racist writers of the 50s. And that's a long story we can talk about some other time. But I think our own personal engagement with this potentially destructive, potentially affirming source, perhaps it's one of the things that always calls us back to study it and to think through it. We know it's significant culturally, historically, politically, but it's also something we're taking a risk by engaging it. But I think it's a risk we're all kind of willing to take. I think that kind of speaks to the question of trauma a bit. But it can go either way. You know what I mean? It's something that can affirm your faith and you can need it, or it's something that it can cause you to walk away from or destroy it. So.
Yeah, good. And then we'll have one last question.
It's just to make it a little bit light. We became very serious. I was controlling myself when Nicole said, answering about trauma, about her wedding anniversary. So it was relating the both. So, and no, I'm sorry about your cousin as well. One thing which I really feel myself sad, my mother passed away, and also through COVID, my baby brother also passed away through COVID. And both of them, by the way, they were vaccinated. I just recalled from there. One thing I'm going to, again, very quickly in few words, answering Arif, that what we need to do is try to minimize the damage. We cannot do more than that as humans, because the damage has done, unfortunately, and really in the worst shape. And I can see when almost 200 families, they settled in Jacksonville from Afghanistan. And when I listen to their experiences, their stories, it's horrifying, beyond, believe me, imagination. But again, we are facing it. And again, faith works a certain level, certain limits. We need to, again, remind ourselves and give them a little bit of satisfaction that, look, this world is a test and you will go through it. You have to face it. There is no real, I would say, medicine for it. Thank you.
So we're at 7:30. I'm going to ask the panelists one last question because I want to honor the time. So the last question is this: how do we, how do we speak of reality and also speak of hope or resilience in the midst of reality? So how do we tell stories that are real and not, someone said cotton candy this week, right? But that are real and admit the real pain and trauma and brokenness around us, and also, but also highlight resilience or hope. So we'll go this way, and I'll say something at the end.
I think there's a whole part of journalism that needs to be factual and report the facts and must not be emotive. So when I read the front page of a newspaper, I just want to know the facts. But I expect when I turn into the paper, I'm going to read the columns, the reviews, the reflections. So I think it's important that, and I'm sure any young journalist is a reporter, a cub reporter, they focus on the news, and we want them to be objective and not bringing their reflections into it. Just give us the news, please. But then you want more senior people to deepen the work. I was thinking about a book I read about by Catherine Boo, and it was about life in a Mumbai slum. And she spent 6 months there. And then she wrote her wonderful stories about it. But when she was in the process of doing that, she went through this terrible guilt. She thought, what am I doing here? What am I adding to this? And why do they need my voice? And it occurred to her that as an outsider, being among these people, what hopefully she was bringing to it was the quality of her attention. And I would hope that good journalism brings a quality of attention. Certainly good mediation should. There's also, by tradition, when a young monk enters a monastery in the Benedictine tradition, the abbot gives them the rule of St. Benedict. And in the preface, there's an exhortation to the new young novice. It says, listen well to your instructions. Listen with the ear of your heart. Now, I like to think good mediation does that. And while I don't want to see inappropriately emotive journalism, because I sometimes just want the facts, I do want to see pieces that show someone who's given a quality of attention and listened with the ear of their heart. And a bit of that in academia would be good too.
Imam, do you want to go next?
Okay, I'm going to make it very brief and short. Coming to media, if you watch Fox News, CNN, or a third one, which I follow a lot, Free Speech TV, if you're familiar with. Same one news, and you will have three angles. One incident, different angles. One amazing, actually, I just recalled an incident. Free Speech TV was reporting on, there was it's like 5-6 years ago, maybe even earlier, shooting in Michigan. And they were trying to catch the shooter. At start, the name was Ahmed or something like that. And every single media was after that news. After 3 days, they figure out it was John. And the news just disappeared. So we need to actually have one right angle for reporting as well. Otherwise, we will be having these bias.
Hope. I am going to do something a bit academic here and talk about something I'm writing and researching. I've been thinking a lot about hope, in part because in my field of Christian ethics, hope, not unlike civility, has fallen on tough times. And there's been some works by scholars I very much respect that have said that hope is useless to the pursuit of justice, that it only anesthetizes, it only subdues, it does not fuel any forms of justice for the marginalized. The work that I'm thinking about in particular cites everything from the Shoah to the Sand Creek Massacre to the death of Black people who are unarmed at the hands of law enforcement who are supposed to protect them. And it's just example after example. And by the end of this particular book, you can't help but blame the author, or you can't blame the author for not feeling very hopeful. But I'm also deeply influenced. My own academic journey is grounded in movements for social justice, where those who are the most oppressed, those who've experienced the most, as you said, unimaginable, absolutely horrific, unimaginable violence, exploitation, have hope. Why? How? And that has really animated my thinking lately. Not, okay, let's move past this negativity, let's expel it because it just makes us, sad sacks. No, the way to be hopeful is to, as you were saying earlier, that realism. It's not to reject negativity. And there's a strong movement within religious studies right now to explore negativity. Afro-pessimism comes to mind, for example. But I'm trying to reflect on these on hope in its relationship with joy, and how those things, how hope and joy properly understood, or well understood, I should say, maybe not proper, but well understood, can help us to continue to do this kind of difficult work, bringing light in times of darkness in ways that are productive. So I think of the season of the liturgical season of Advent, for example, and the liturgical colors that we use during that time are this deep purple. So even the darkness is not something to be feared. It's a gorgeous color, but it invokes for us that which is hard to see, as you were saying, that which we experience this deepness in our liturgical season. But then you have one Sunday, I know it's rose, but it's pink, where we are reminded of joy, we're reminded of hope, and that does not say, okay, now we have to get rid of all the purple because we like pink and because we want to be hopeful, but those residing together are important. So how can we in our professions as faith leaders, academics, journalists, have this advental posture towards the world, or finding a cognate season or ritual or tradition within your own a tradition, and how might that help us to navigate this time? So, yeah.
Very quick coda on this conversation that Nicole made me think about. You may be familiar with, if you're not, you should look it up. Václav Havel's definition of hope, which is in Disturbing the Peace, which is hope is not hope for an expected outcome, that something's going to turn out a particular way. My paraphrase is maybe the arc of the universe bends toward justice, maybe not, but it's not an expectation of a particular outcome. Instead, rather, he's much more eloquent, hope is a horizon of possibility that is rooted in doing something for the sake of its intrinsic goodness. And you're doing this because it's the right thing to do by your own moral compass. And that's the source of real hope, not a particular outcome. And this conversation with all of you from your different perspectives, committing to the good work you're doing is, I think, legitimately by Havel's definition, a source of real hope, that you're doing something, you hope for good outcomes, you hope for placing your pieces and mediating conflict for a particular outcome. But in fact, it's the actual nature of the work itself and your commitment to it because of its intrinsic worth that is the source of real hope. So thanks for a great panel.
Yeah, thanks to everyone. I say thanks to the Ansari Institute for inviting us here. Thanks for everyone who participated. Thanks for your vulnerability and for your willingness to be resilient and to say, how can we do this work better, and how can we reframe things, and how can we do exactly that? How can we do things that are good and right and persist in doing them for a long time? So thank you.